Students, so far we discussed about the China and the Japan. We have discussed about the political history of China and Japan, which are the two important East Asian countries. Now we are moving towards the third country of East Asia, and that is the Korea. So you can see from the map that this is the Korea, this is the peninsular region which is surrounded by water from three sides in Pacific Ocean. So you can see that there are two Korea, North Korea and the South Korea. So this is the present condition of Korea. There are two countries, North Korea which is ruled by a dictator, and the name of that dictator is Kim Jong-un, and the South Korea is a democracy. So earlier it used to be one nation, and how it got divided into two, that we will discuss here. And what is the present condition of Korea, that we will also discuss. What is the political history of Korea, that we will discuss today. So the story of Korea. During the late 19th century, Korea's Joseon dynasty faced internal political and social strife and increasing foreign pressure from China, Japan and the Western powers. So earlier it used to be having a monarchy, and there was a ruling dynasty that is known as the Joseon dynasty, and the Joseon dynasty was ruling for last 500 years. But there was internal strife thereafter, social strife was there. So now Korea was facing internal strife, as well as it was also facing the external strife from the world power. Like we know that Japan, which is a neighboring country of Korea, that became imperialist in its ideology, and it wanted to invade the Korea. So it was facing a threat from Japan. It was also facing threat from China and from some other Western powers, because that was the period of colonization, and Western powers wanted to make as much as possible other countries as their colony, because India was also a colony at that time. After decades of political interference, the Imperial Japan annexed Korea as its colony in 1910, bringing the over 500 years long Joseon dynasty to its end. Finally, Japan invaded on Korea, and Korea got a defeat because it was already weak due to the internal strife. As a result, the ruling dynasty, Joseon dynasty, which was ruling in Korea for last 500 years, that came to an end, and it became a colony of Japan. Desiring independence, Koreans around the country demonstrated against the colonial occupation. They set up provisional government and sent delegation to appeal to foreign leaders at international meetings such as the Cairo and the Potsdam conferences. So the Koreans wanted to regain their sovereignty. They wanted to become again an independent country. For that, they wanted that there should be internal as well as the external pressure on the Japan. So they demonstrated internally. They set up interim government in different regions of Korea. They also sent their delegation to the important conferences which were going on in different parts of the world, like the Cairo conference, which was conducted in Egypt, and many countries were taking part in it, including Japan, including US and Britain. So Korea sought help from these countries because these all were suffering because of Japan. So they wanted their help against the Japan so that it can regain its sovereignty. Then the delegates were also sent to the Potsdam conferences, which gave sovereignty to China, and they also wanted the same kind of favor for Korea also, so that international pressure can be there on Japan, and Japan made the Korea free country, it get its freedom back. Now, what happened thereafter? There was World War. As we know that it took place from 1939 to 45. And Korea, which was a colony of Japan, it was going to be affected due to that World War. Because in 1945, Japan got a defeat at the hand of US and Allied forces. As a result, Japan became very weak. And that was the time to get the freedom back by the Koreans. So the Japanese colonial rule ended after 35 years in August 1945 with Japan's defeat in the World War II. So Korea became the colony of Japan in 1910, and after 35 years when Japan got a defeat in the World War II, then the Korea became a free country. But what happened along with the getting the freedom. It was the continued effort of the independence activists both inside as well as outside the Korea, because they were sending their delegation in different conferences, that ensured Korea's independence after the Japan's defeat. The Korean peninsula was temporarily divided. They got the freedom, but at the same time, the Korean peninsula was divided into two parts, and that dividing line was the 38th parallel. So you can see that this is 38th parallel, and this is a latitude of 38° north. So the Korea was divided into two parts, two halves. The upper part is known as the North Korea, and the lower part is known as the South Korea. And now this forms the border of the North Korea and the South Korea. And it was divided temporarily at that time, but later on this division became the permanent, and till date the Korea is divided into two parts, North Korea and the South Korea. So North Korea, which is very close to Russia, so it was maintained by the Russia, which was earlier known as the USSR, United Socialist Soviet Russia, and the southern part was taken care of by the UNO, United Nations Organization. This division became permanent as separate governments were established in both the countries in 1948. So in 1948, the governments were established in these two parts, and there were separate governments in North Korea and the South Korea. As a result, the Korean people also lost the hope that they would be reunited again. Now what happened after the war of Second World War, and it got its freedom? So what kind of modernization was there in Korea, that we are going to discuss here. So the post-war nation. In June 1950, the Korean War broke out. So right after its independence in 1948, in 1950, the North Korea and the South Korea started fighting against each other. South Korea received support from the US-led United Nations. So US was the most dominant power in United Nations. So US came in support of South Korea, but the North Korea was given the support from Communist China. As a result, the two Koreas were fighting against each other, and the major power of the world were also playing their role in it, because that was the period of Cold War, and there were two ideologies, capitalism and communism, or socialism and communism. So China was very close to the socialism and communism, which was started by the Russia, and North Korea was also maintained by the Russia. As a result, China supported the North Korea. But South Korea was supported by UNO, and there was Cold War situation. If North Korea is supported by the socialist power, then naturally the South Korea would be supported by the capitalist power. As a result, US came in support of the South Korea, and still it is in the support of the South Korea. In July 1953, after 3 years, the war ended in an armistice agreement. So what is armistice agreement? This agreement is a kind of agreement which takes place between the army of two countries. So the ceasefire was done under an armistice agreement, and the war was ended by that, but still the Korea remained divided. Price suddenly rose due to the inflation caused by increased national expenses and currency issued during the war. So during the war time, a lot of expenditure is incurred in a nation. As a result, the economy of the South Korea was also shattered. So they issued their currencies during this war so that they can meet the war expenditure. But ultimately the outcome of this war was that the economy of the South Korea got deteriorated, and there was a very slow economic growth. Its economy was completely collapsed. As a result, it got support from the USA. So the economy of Korea could be sustained with the help of USA, and USA provided a lot of help to the South Korea. Then what happened thereafter? You can see from the image that this is a person, and his name is Singh Man. So he was the first president of South Korea. South Korea's first president, that was the Singh Man, had been elected in 1948, right after the independence, through the democratic process after the Korean War. He extended his administration twice through the illegal constitutional amendments. So he was the first president who was elected through an electoral politics. So he was the legitimate president of the South Korea. But when he became the president, he started amending the constitution of South Korea. As a result, according to his own views and in his own interest, he amended the constitution of South Korea twice so that he can remain in the position of the president in South Korea. And that is called as the illegal constitutional amendments made by Singh Man. In April 1960, citizens protested against a rigged election in which what is known as the April Revolution, and Lee was forced to resign. So since he amended the constitution illegally, as a result, opposition rose against him in the Korea, and students and opposition parties started a movement against Singh Man, and ultimately he was forced to resign. As a result, he could not be a president anymore. Then what happened after the Singh Man resignation? Who came into the power and what were their policies, that we will discuss. So after Singh Man resignation, Democratic Party, which was an opposition party, that formed the government. The spirit of the people which had been expressed during the Reed administration erupted in the form of demonstration and demands. Singh Man was a kind of dictator. As a result, the democratic demand of the people were suppressed by him. But now he was no more a president. As a result, these demands erupted in the form of demonstration. Now there was a lot of aspiration in the Korean people that what they wanted from the government. But the Democratic Party administration which took power after the Ree's resignation could not properly respond to the citizens' demand due to the internal division and conflict. So the party which ruled after the Singh Man, that was a weak party, and there was also internal strife in the party. As a result, the demand of the Korean people or the aspirations of the Korean people could not be fulfilled by this party, and it could not respond well to their demands. As a result, the opposition also rose against this party. The students' movement grew into a unification movement against this party. In May 1961, the Democratic Party government was overthrown and a military coup staged by General Park Geun-hye and other military authorities. So that was a time in which opposition was going on against the ruling party, that was the Democratic Party. And the military leaders took the advantage of that movement against the Democratic Party. They took the advantage of the anger of the people against the Democratic Party, and they initiated a military coup against this party. And this initiation was done by the General Park Geun-hye, who was the military commander of Korea. And as a result, Park Geun-hye brought a coup in the Korea, and the democratically elected government was overthrown by him, and a military rule was set up in South Korea. Now what happened after that? The military rule was started by Park Geun-hye, who was a military general. Rapid industrialization and under this strong leadership. His leadership is considered to be one of the strongest leadership of South Korea. What amendments were brought by him, that we will discuss. In October 1963, an election was held and military coup leader Park Geun-hye was elected as the president. So initially he brought a military coup in Korea, but now through the election he elected himself as the president of Korea. So he became a legitimate president of Korea after the election of 1963. The Park administration adopted a state-led export-oriented policy to achieve economic growth. He wanted to grow Korea economically. As a result, he adopted a policy that is known as export-oriented policy. Under this export-oriented policy, he wanted to increase the export from Korea so that Korean goods could be sold in the world market and a much needed foreign exchange can be brought in the Korea. The 5 years economic plan was also introduced by the government in favor of the large corporate firms placed emphasis on expanding employment and increased Korea's competitiveness. So he supported the large business houses so that an economic development of Korea can be initiated, and due to the large scale industrialization in Korea, they can also generate the employment where the people can get the job. So that was his aim. And he also wanted to increase the competitiveness of the Korea. So what do we understand from the competitiveness? They wanted to make the products which could compete in the world market with the products of other countries. So he wanted to improve the quality of the product. As a result, he supported the large business houses and large scale industries of Korea. In the early 1960s, when the state policy shifted from import substitution industrialization, that is called as the ISI, towards the focus on export. So earlier he implemented the export oriented policy, but still there was a lot of import from other countries. Now the government followed the import substitution policies. It means whatever items were imported from other countries, they needed to be substituted in the country. The items should be manufactured in the country which can substitute the foreign items. So they followed the policy of import substitution policy so that import can be reduced in Korea and their money could be stopped in outflowing in the other countries. Now what happened thereafter? What were the outcomes of his policy? That we will discuss. Rapid industrialization under his strong leadership. So he was a strong leader who took wise decisions. As a result, there was startling economic growth in the Korea. Under the export-oriented policy, the government supported labor-intensive light industrial products. So initially, they supported the light industrial product. And what are the light industrial products? Like the electronic items. They supported this kind of product so that more and more items can be sent outside, and since these products are also labor intensive, why he initiated the labor intensive industries? Because he wanted to increase the employment in the country which was required in the country. During the late 1960s and 70s, the focus again shifted from light industries to the value added heavy and chemical industries. So initially he supported the light industries, but in 1970s they again shifted their focus to the heavyweight industries which can produce the heavyweight products, and heavy industries like the motor vehicle industries, shipbuilding industries, they were supported by the Korean government. In 1970, the New Village movement, that is also known as the Singh movement, was also initiated by the Korean government because they wanted to modernize the rural economy and they wanted to upgrade the living standard of the rural population. So this movement was launched and they wanted that the rural economy should be independent. As a result, this movement was launched in some part of Korea, but later on it was spread throughout the Korea. And this movement was very successful, which upgraded the living standard of the people in villages and which also modernized the Korean villages. Later on, this movement was also copied by some other countries of the world. Rural people were empowered to help themselves in developing their villages so that they can become the upgraded villages. So this movement was launched by the government and improve the living condition of their respective communities. So the rural community standard could be upgraded. That's why this movement was launched, and this movement was having an immense success. So we can say that the policies which was adopted by Park Chung-hee's administration, these were quite successful, and that led to the rapid economic growth in Korea, and Korea became a modern nation of the world. And that's why the leadership of Park Chung-hee is considered to be the strong leadership in Korea. These all policies were adopted by the administration of Park Chung-hee. So what was its outcome? Like it followed the policy of export orientation. It also adopted the policy of import substitution. So the focus was to export more things and import less things. And then this wanted to upgrade the rural economy. As a result, they adopted the policy of Singh movement. As a result, there was a startling economic growth in Korea. There was a rapid growth in Korea. Strong leaders, well-trained bureaucrats, and aggressive industrialists and capable labor force. So these are the factors which are considered to be the responsible for the rapid economic growth in Korea. And thereafter there were ambitious entrepreneurs, were those entrepreneurs who wanted to invest in the field of industry so that the economy of Korea could be upgraded, could be modernized. The high level of education was also provided to the worker and the Korean people. As a result, the Korean workforce was more educated and more skillful. That also led to the rapid economic growth in Korea. Then countries' open economic policy. They did not isolate their economy like the China and Japanese people. They opened their policies so that more and more foreign investment can come, more and more product of their country could be sold in the world market. So that also helped in the rapid industrialization of Korea. Work to absorb more advanced institutions and technology from other countries, and that could only come into the Korea through the open economic policy and trading relation with the other countries of the world. Foreign investment and Korea's high domestic saving rate were also considered to be responsible for the higher economic growth of the Korea. And the remittance from the South Korean overseas workers. There were many workers of South Korea who worked outside the country. They were working in different countries. As a result, they used to send a lot of foreign exchange in their own country, and that was also a factor which is responsible for the Korea's rapid development. Now we will discuss that what constitutional amendment was done by Park Chung-hee. The Yusin Constitution. This is one of the most controversial constitutional amendment which was made by Park Chung-hee. So what was this Yusin Constitution and what was its outcome? Park revised the constitution so that he could run for third term and was re-elected in 1971. 2 terms he had already ruled the Korea, but now he wanted to rule in the third term. So he changed the criteria for election. As a result, he made an amendment in the constitution and as a result he was elected in 1971 again for the third time. In October 1972, Park declared and implemented the Yusin Constitution, which made permanent presidency possible. Now, he stopped the election of president and he wanted that he could rule the Korea till his death. So that amendment was made by Park Chung-hee so that he can rule Korea throughout his life. The president had complete authority over legislation, jurisdiction and administration, and also had a constitutional right to repeal any law as an emergency measure. So these amendments were made by him. The 3 pillars of democracy, that is the legislation, jurisdiction and executive body, or we can say the administration, these all were kept under the command of the president. Now president became the sole authority of Korea. He became an absolute authority of Korea, and that brought dictatorship in Korea. And secondly, he also got the constitutional right that he could repeal any law, he could cancel any law which is passed by the Korean legislature, and he could repeal it as an emergency measure. So we can say that the entire authority of the Korea was now lying in the hand of Park Chung-hee, and he became an absolute ruler of Korea. Now, what this constitutional amendment led to, that we will discuss here. So outcomes of the Yusin Constitution. The progress of democracy was temporarily suspended in pursuit of the economic development. Korea wanted to have a rapid economic development. As a result, the democratic feelings were suppressed, democracy was suppressed. The second oil crisis, which took place in 1979, acted as a hindrance to the economic policy which had over-invested in the heavy chemical industry. So there was oil crisis in Korea and it affected the economy of the Korea in 1979. Since the chemical industry was also a backbone of industrial development of Korea, and that got a jolt because of this oil crisis of 1979. So there was a hindrance in the economic growth of Korea because of the oil crisis. Students, scholars and the opposition continually demonstrated against the using constitution as the Pak administration's innovation of emergency measures and suppression brought about political instability. Now opposition party who were also having the ambition to rule Korea, they started opposing the Park Chung-hee, and this was also a chance for them to oppose the government, and they opposed the Park Chung-hee's amendment and which he implemented, that is the institution using constitution, that was opposed by the students and other political parties. As a result, there increased political instability in Korea and there was turmoil in the political condition of Korea. The Park administration came to an end after that in October 1979, and when Park Chung-hee was assassinated. Finally, Park Chung-hee, who became the absolute ruler of Korea, he was assassinated during this movement and after the oil crisis. As a result, Park Chung-hee's administration came to an end and an absolutist ruler of Korea came to an end thereafter.